Welcome to an archival reconstruction, December 15th, 1864. The handwriting in the surviving field log is uneven, the ink blotted where frost touched the page. It reads, "We were ordered forward. The ground was frozen. No drum, no bugle, only the wind. There is no name. Only a unit number, 17th U.S. Colored Troops. Beneath it, faint pressure lines mark a phrase written and erased, advance without sound." The next page was torn away, but the imprint of lost ink remains visible under angled light. When examined years later, it revealed the ghost of a sentence pressed into the paper. They moved as if unseen. The archivist who cataloged the journal noted that the book had been found in an attic near Nashville, water-stained and warped by cold. He described the damage as consistent with prolonged exposure to open air, and his handwriting shook slightly on the report. From the Freedmen's Bureau Correspondent's Nashville office, February 1865. Families came asking for news of the colored men attached to the advance line. We found no burial ground, no list of wounded, no officer recalled their movement. The letter bears a simple signature, Clerk District 5. There is no follow-up, no reply, and no mention of the regiment in later reports. The line ends with a period that looks carved into the paper, as if the pen stopped in disbelief. In the printed Union Registry, the section where the 17th and 18th USCT should appear is blank. A single dash runs across the column where their record should have been, dividing the page in silence. Beneath it, another hand has written, "No report received." To the modern reader, it is only a clerical omission. But to those searching for names, it is a grave made of paper. A WPA narrative recorded in 1937 preserves a memory from Davidson County. The speaker, an old man, recalled, "My granddaddy say they went down the hill and never came up, but folks hear marching still when the ground freeze right before Christmas. Boots sound hollow like on wood." The interviewer noted that he refused to step on frozen ground while speaking. That small act of avoidance remains the only movement attached to their story. No official photograph survives. But in letters from nearby officers, fragments echo the same confusion. Lieutenant Charles W. Adams wrote to his wife 2 days later, "There was confusion on the left flank. The colored troops advanced too far. When I looked again, the slope was empty, as if the earth had taken them." The line fades halfway through, the word "earth" swallowed by an ink stain that bleeds through to the reverse side. A civilian diary from Nashville, dated December 16th, reads, "Heard firing south of the river. Strange wind, no echo. The smoke hung still in the air as if nailed there." Later pencil editions read, "Men said the colored soldiers vanished into it. The handwriting trails downward off the edge of the paper as if the recorder lost the strength to finish." A surgeon's field note without signature lists morning casualties. The final entry reads, "No bodies recovered. Only boots frozen upright in the soil." Below that line, a stain spreads like frostbite. Archivists later described it as chemical residue, but under magnification it resembles a human heel. Quartermaster reports from March 1865 describe the same ground as undisturbed, marshy, no remains found. 2 surveyors penciled their own note footprints visible beneath the thaw. They did not return to confirm. The accompanying map is missing from the record. Its reference number appears in a file about horse requisitions instead. In 1909, a farmer plowing near Nolensville unearthed several rusted rifles and a single brass button stamped USCT. The Nashville Banner printed the discovery under the headline, "Ghosts of the Franklin Line." The story ends halfway through a sentence mid-column, and the next issue never continues it. Local folklore kept the memory alive where paper failed. Elders warned children not to whistle near the hollow where the frost never melted. Some said that on the coldest nights a low counting voice carried across the ground, steady, rhythmic, never reaching 10. Whether the tale began as memory or myth, no one ever built over the site. In 1941, a WPA field worker, James R. Whitfield, recorded an interview with a woman who had been an infant during the battle. Her voice, faint but steady on the aluminum disc, said, "Some nights the frost shine white on that field, and you can hear them, men without graves. They call roll one by one." Her voice catches on the last word. The tape ends with a burst of static. Whitfield never filed his final report. His last diary entry mentions leaving to revisit the site. 2 weeks later, his car was found abandoned on a dirt road outside Antioch. Inside was a satchel containing his notes and a single recording reel. The tape ends abruptly, and then the sound came again, boots in mud that wasn't there. When cataloged decades later, his file was indexed under unlocated action, colored troops, December 1864. The phrase appears nowhere else in military records. It exists as an archival placeholder, a category for an event that cannot be found. Researchers have since searched every map and roster for the missing regiment. None agree on its strength or its loss. The ledgers remain uncorrected. In every attempt to close the record, the same space stays blank as though the silence itself were protected. Across all accounts, one detail repeats: the sound. Witnesses describe boots striking frozen earth, always in cadence, always distant. It moves through letters, through songs, through the low hum of recollection. Even the wind recorded that rhythm, carrying it into winter air that refused to thaw. What remains now are fragments, a journal missing its author, a letter that ends too soon, a tape that dissolves into static. Together they form the outline of something erased, something half-seen. The past has left only its pulse, faint but unbroken, repeating through each surviving word. The State Archive lists the folder between files on supply routes and horse requisitions. Its binding is cracked, its label nearly gone. In faint pencil, someone wrote, "They marched before dawn. They did not return." The paper holds the same silence that once hung over the frozen ridge, a silence that still answers when the air turns cold. The surviving documentation surrounding the disappearance of the colored regiments near Nashville is fragmentary, scattered across archives in Tennessee, Washington, and Illinois. The first official reference appears in a post-war filing list compiled by the War Department in 1872. A marginal note in faint blue pencil reads, "Partial return, no action recorded." Beneath the line, another hand added in darker ink, "Missing December 15 to 16, 1864. No map coordinates accompany the note. The absence of detail stands out against the bureaucratic precision of other files from that campaign. The logbook attributed to the 17th U.S. Colored Troops entered the State Archive in 1921, donated anonymously by a descendant of a quartermaster's clerk. The accession card lists the object as found among household effects. The clerk's name has been lost, but the handwriting is consistent with Army ledgers from the Western Theater. A historian who examined the document in 1953 described it as structurally sound, legible, and incomplete. He concluded that several leaves had been torn from the binding, possibly to conceal irregularities in record keeping. The diary of Lieutenant Charles W. Adams was preserved by his family until 1918, when it was microfilmed for university archives. The missing page that might have described the battle was already gone by then. In its place, a torn edge shows remnants of blue ink, as though a damp thumb had smeared the words beyond recovery. The archivist's summary ends with the line, "No mention of colored troops after entry dated December 16. The document is catalogued under Private Correspondence Field, a category that rarely receives re-examination unless requested by researchers studying Union logistics. The Freedmen's Bureau Correspondence District 5 is one of the few surviving civilian accounts that acknowledge the disappearance at all. It was written by a clerk whose identity has not been traced. No officer's signature appears above or below his text. The page survives only as a carbon copy, fragile and thin, with faint imprints of typewriter keys pressing through the reverse. When read under low light, another letter becomes visible beneath it, a second unfinished draft where the clerk began the same sentence, but stopped after 3 words. They were gone. Folklorists have long debated whether oral accounts collected in the 1930s accurately preserve 19th century memory. In this case, the pattern of retelling is unusually stable. At least 6 independent WPA fieldworkers documented nearly identical recollections from families around Davidson and Williamson counties. Each remembered a winter morning when the colored soldiers went down the hill and didn't come back. Each insisted that the ground still moved when frost appeared. None of the informants knew one another, and their statements were recorded weeks apart. The fieldworkers themselves left behind marginal notes describing the atmosphere in which these stories were told. One wrote, "Interview conducted outdoors. Subject refused to stand on frozen earth. Kept glancing toward the field." Another noted, "The woman would not say the name Nashville, only that place near the ridge." The consistency of this unease suggests that the story was not merely symbolic folklore, but a localized memory carried quietly through generations who could neither verify nor forget it. A small number of official maps reference the terrain south of the city in vague terms. On one copy of the engineer's sketch of December operations, Army of the Cumberland, a faint set of hand-drawn contour lines mark an unnamed ridge beside a narrow creek. No units are labeled there, only the word lowland. Later copies remove the marking entirely. A notation in the archive catalog reads, "Original damaged by humidity. replacement drawn from recollection. One of the few verifiable geographical coordinates comes from a 1909 land survey following the discovery of rusted rifles and a USCT button. The county assessor's field book records irregular soil compression at lower slope. The terminology reflects technical observation, but the entry was later crossed out in red pencil, possibly by a superior who regarded it as irrelevant to property assessment. When researchers sought the physical site in the 1970s, the ridge had been reforested. Ground-penetrating radar yielded inconclusive results. In 1942, the year after James R. Whitfield vanished, the Tennessee Historical Commission briefly investigated his disappearance. Their internal memorandum stated fieldworker missing, equipment recovered, cause undetermined. The tape reels he recorded were transcribed in part by a junior assistant who described hearing repetitive thumping sounds near the end of the final reel. She marked them as equipment noise. The transcript's last line before the cut reads, "and they answered." The assistant's initials appear below in small cursive LMW. Whitfield's case became a minor footnote in the administrative history of the Federal Writers Project. His supervisor's report emphasized that no verifiable connection exists between the subject matter of his final assignment and his subsequent disappearance. Yet local rumor persisted that he had gone searching for a battlefield no one could locate. In the Nashville Public Library's vertical files, a handwritten card still bears his name under the subject "Missing Researchers." It remains one of the few personal documents linked to the story. Over the decades, attempts to reconcile the archival record with local oral memory have produced conflicting theories. Some historians attribute the disappearance of documentation to clerical confusion at the chaotic close of the war, when multiple colored regiments were merged or disbanded before final returns were filed. Others suspect deliberate omission. In 1988, a retired librarian noted that several pages in the bound War Department report on December operations had been physically removed, leaving visible stitch marks. The missing pages correspond exactly to the period when the colored regiments were engaged near Nashville. The broader context of that winter supports the likelihood of an undocumented skirmish. Heavy fog and freezing temperatures disrupted communication across the battlefield. Many of the colored units were newly formed and commanded by white officers unfamiliar with their companies. Orders were often relayed orally through intermediaries who might have misunderstood direction. Under those conditions, a detached advance or misinterpreted charge could easily vanish from coordinated reporting, particularly if losses were severe. Yet the persistence of folklore complicates purely logistical explanations. The memory of sound boots in cadence heard but unseen recurs with such regularity that it becomes an acoustic signature, not a metaphor. Sound lingers where sight fails. Oral historians have noted that in African American vernacular tradition, rhythm often functions as a marker of continuity between the living and the dead. The marching heard under frost could thus represent both memory and presence existing outside the written archive but inside cultural recall. In the Nashville State Archives Box 214 Folder 7 lies the last official attempt to classify the event. Its typed label reads, "Unlocated Action, Colored Troops, December 15 to 16, 1864. The report inside contains only 2 sentences. No confirmed engagement found. Oral evidence persists. The final word of the second sentence is underlined twice. The paper is brittle, its edges brown and translucent, and its text ends without a period, as if the typist expected another page to follow." The scholar who last handled that file in 2003 left a notation on the archival request slip. The absence here feels deliberate. It is a statement without academic foundation, yet it captures the strange gravity of the record, a gravity not created by what is preserved but by what refuses to appear. No single document explains why an entire movement of soldiers, their names and their dead, slipped through the structure of history. Their existence survives in the gap between fact and recollection, between ink and voice. And within that gap, the field near Nashville remains both a place and an idea, the edge where record ends and memory begins. The known records of the 17th and 18th U.S. colored troops during the Nashville campaign begin with official dispatches from Major General George H. Thomas's headquarters, dated December 14, 1864. These orders describe the positioning of divisions around the city's southern perimeter, but make only passing mention of supporting detachments of colored troops assigned to forward picket duty. No numerical designation is attached. A later transcript produced by the War Records Office in 1875 omits the reference entirely. When compared line by line to the original dispatch, faint marks of erasure appear, where the words colored troops once stood. The archivist's summary calls it likely an editing decision to condense phrasing. In the regimental returns of the 17th USCT, the final confirmed entry before the battle is dated December 10th. It reports 546 men present for duty. The next return, filed in January 1865, lists 317. The difference of 229 men is annotated with a brief remark, detached on special operation, presumed absorbed by consolidation. The term special operation has no explanation elsewhere in the records. On later printed rosters, the January entry appears without the annotation, leaving only the lower total. A letter from Captain Horace B. Gardner to his commanding officer on December 20th adds another fragment. Gardner wrote, "My flank was to be supported by colored infantry advancing through the hollow. We heard their volley once, then silence. No flag returned." His tone is administrative, not emotional. He records the absence as an obstacle, not a mystery. But the neutrality of the statement underscores the indifference that can erase entire lives from the historical ledger. In the same week, the Nashville Union and American printed an article praising the victory over Hood's Confederate Army. The story lists the divisions that participated, naming white regiments with precision. At the end, one sentence reads, "Negro troops rendered service in limited engagements." The phrase is repeated verbatim in multiple newspapers across the state, as though drawn from an official press release. It marks the limit of acknowledgement service, but not sacrifice. In contrast, the oral record holds detail absent from paper. Among the WPA narratives collected in 1936 and 1937, at least 9 interviewees describe a body of black soldiers who went too far during the battle. One said, "They was told to wait, but they kept on. Folks say the smoke opened and took them." Another recalled, "My uncle say they walkin' fast, but no sound under they feet." A third added, "They charged through frost and the ground close back." Each statement was recorded in a different county. None used the word Nashville. One field worker, a young woman named Clara Dean, wrote in her notebook, subject's tone matter of fact. No sense of legend. Spoke as one recalling a remembered event, not repeating folklore. Her observation would be ignored in the published compilation, which categorized all such stories under folk superstitions. The narrative of disappearance was thus classified out of history and into myth. Folklore from the same region preserves a chant associated with the battle. It appears in a 1940s spiritual collected by John Work III at Fisk University titled "Down by the Cold Ground." The lyrics shift between grief and persistence. They march before the sun could see cold ground keep their company. No drum to call, no bugle to sound, just frost and footstep underground. The repetition of cold ground mirrors phrases in multiple WPA interviews, suggesting continuity between oral memory and song. At the intersection of fact and folklore stands a civilian witness, a Quaker nurse named Sarah Colvin, who served with the Hospital Transport Corps. In her unpublished journal preserved at Duke University, she writes, "The colored regiment moved before dawn. I watched them pass beyond the hedgerow. They did not return. At noon a messenger brought back their wounded, yet spoke of none who could walk. I asked how many. He said, 'They gone where names don't follow.' The handwriting is steady until that sentence, which leans sharply upward before breaking off mid-page." Colvin's account is corroborated in part by a requisition order dated December 18th for bandages, field stretchers, and mule transport for unrecorded casualties. The requisition lacks a regimental identifier, but bears the initials HS, possibly an abbreviation for hospital supply. On the reverse, faint pencil scrawl reads, "For them lost in the frost." The phrase appears nowhere else in the archive. From these fragments emerges the outline of a vanished action, a pre-dawn movement, a volley, a silence, and the absence of return. The precision of military paperwork ends exactly where the uncertainty begins. In the administrative rhythm of war, a gap becomes self-perpetuating. Once an event lacks coordinates, later files can only repeat its absence. Meanwhile, in the oral layer, the story deepens rather than disappears. A woman interviewed in 1938 said, "My mama told me they still out there under the cold hill listening for orders. She say sometimes the frost whisper back telling 'em to rest. When asked if she believed it true, she replied, 'Don't have to believe what ain't finished yet.'" The fieldworker noted her phrasing without commentary. Another testimony recorded in 1940 in neighboring Williamson County links the story to a local custom. The speaker, an elderly farmer, explained, "Every Christmas we hang tin on the fence so the wind can talk. That's for them soldiers who didn't get called home." The interviewer's marginalia adds, "He refused payment saying the words weren't his to sell." The contrast between documentation and recollection forms a rhythm of its own, the factual record moving in one direction, the spoken word circling back. Together they create what one archivist later called the sound of missing pages. In that sound, fact becomes echo, and folklore becomes evidence, each validating the other's existence through absence. Military summaries remain silent beyond statistical loss. Oral histories insist on continuity, claiming that on winter nights the air itself remembers the cadence. Whether read as metaphor or memory, the effect is the same. The frozen ground becomes an archive the paper cannot hold. Across both layers, written and spoken, the story of the charge at Nashville does not resolve. It reverberates unfinished, as though the record itself were marching still. The tension between written record and oral memory began long before historians noticed the gap. In early January 1865, a brief correspondence circulated within the quartermaster department. It referred to missing material associated with colored troops of recent engagement. No itemization follows. The paper trail halts with the note inquiry, unnecessary, presumed loss in field. The bureaucratic closure hides what absence really meant: men, not supplies. When later clerks recopied these files, they merged materiel and personnel into one unreadable blot, a word that could mean either. Decades later, the historian Samuel W. Parks, writing in 1912, called attention to the anomaly of a gap in the colored regimental line during the Battle of Nashville. He suggested that a detached unit may have been absorbed into another formation without record. His footnote cites oral recollections of unidentified local informants. The word unidentified reappears 6 times in his article. Each iteration erases the very witnesses he depends on. A microfilm reel in the Tennessee archive holds fragments of a telegraph exchange between Union officers stationed south of the city. One message reads, "Advance element colored has not rejoined main force." The reply filed 6 hours later, "No such detachment listed." The next transmission is incomplete. Only one legible word remains at the bottom margin: returned. Whether the sender meant the soldiers or the message, no one knows. The page bears heat damage as though burned before copying. In the oral layer, contradiction deepens. An interview from the WPA field notes records an elderly woman saying, "My uncle saw 'em march all lined up quiet, no shout, no song. Said the white officer wave his hat once and then they gone behind the frost. He say next morning the field smooth again, no track. When asked who the officer was, she answered, 'Nobody knew his name. Folks say he ain't from here.'" The interviewer added tone uncertain mixture of recollection and dream. Another interview describes men seen walking at dusk near the same ridge decades later. They wore blue coats and no faces, the storyteller said. Just shadow where eyes should be. They carry rifles, but no sound come from them. The field worker noted the informant's shaking hands and refused to record further detail, marking the page subject emotional. In these accounts, the soldiers do not vanish once they continue returning, neither alive nor gone, walking a boundary between memory and report. The contradictions multiply in official correspondence. A Union logistics memo dated March 1865 lists unaccounted for: 3 wagons, 42 mules, 1 regiment colored. The absurdity of scale suggests clerical sarcasm or error, yet the handwriting is steady, the tone practical. In the margin, a different pen adds "verify when ground thaws." No verification followed. When the War Records Office compiled the official records of the Union and Confederate armies in the 1880s, editors struggled with missing reports from colored regiments. In volume KXLV Part 1, the Nashville operations include an asterisked note, several returns and supplementary documents destroyed by dampness. No explanation appears regarding which documents or whose. Later editions remove the note entirely. The revision turned decay into disappearance. Folklore kept reasserting what records erased. In 1939, an old man told interviewer Charles Green they still out there under frost. "You can hear 'em knocking rifles together, countin' step." Green replied, "You mean ghosts?" The man answered, "No. Soldiers. You don't call the ones still marchin' ghosts." His voice was steady enough that the interviewer's annotation reads only "speaker serious." In the winter of 1940, just before Whitfield began his own field work, a letter appeared in the Nashville Banner. It was unsigned, written in a formal hand on lined paper. "Sir, why are the colored dead of the Ridge not named among the honored?" The editor published it under the heading "Anonymous Inquiry," adding the note, "No evidence of such burial." The next day, a reader responded, "Let the dead rest where they fell." The exchange ended there. By 1941, the same year Whitefield vanished, folklore and fact were converging uneasily. His surviving notes record a meeting with a local preacher who refused to identify his congregation, but spoke of the night when the Lord froze the earth to keep their bodies from sinking too deep. Whitefield typed in parentheses possible adaptation of resurrection imagery. His attempt to rationalize belief became his last documented analysis before the tape stopped recording. A pattern of broken records continues through the 20th century. In 1963, an Army historian named Elaine Morton requested access to the Nashville battlefield maps. The archive replied, "Certain December 1864 terrain charts unavailable, missing since 1942. Her personal papers, held today at a university collection, include a note, "Every path I trace ends at frozen ground." That phrase echoes the old song, "Down by the Cold Ground," suggesting that folklore had begun to shape research language itself. The tension between data and memory forms a recursion. Each effort to close the record reopens the wound. Oral testimony insists on a sound that paper cannot carry. Official history requires absence to maintain coherence. When witnesses say they hear marching under frost, the historian hears metaphor. When the archive lists nothing, the listener hears confirmation that something once stood there. Sometimes the two collide directly. In 1987, a field archaeologist surveying for a highway expansion uncovered rusted fragments of musket barrels and buttons marked U.S. in the same ridge area. The State Historical Office logged them as possibly agricultural scrap. Local residents protested, citing the story of the marching men. Construction halted for 2 months, then resumed. The artifacts vanished into storage without catalog number. The report lists them under MIS, metal debris. One elderly resident who had given testimony to the WPA decades earlier was still alive. She was interviewed again by a local journalist. Her statement was short, "They keep digging the wrong place. You don't find what won't be buried." The journalist published the quote as metaphor, unaware that she meant it literally. A researcher visiting the ridge in winter 1991 described hearing intermittent rhythmic vibration through frozen soil picked up by seismic equipment. The report attributes it to vehicular resonance from distant roadway, yet the pattern matched a slow, consistent cadence too regular for traffic. The observation was filed, but never peer-reviewed. Each attempt to reconcile the story fractures into two directions. On one side, data corrodes, ink fades, pages, misfile definitions blur. On the other, voices repeat with steady rhythm. They went down the hill. The ground moved once. The sound stayed. In the archive, this dual motion feels like breathing exhale of written loss, inhale of spoken persistence. By the time modern historians revisit the Nashville engagement, the conflict between archival silence and oral endurance has become the story itself. What began as a missing entry has turned into an evolving testimony, a march that refuses conclusion. Every investigation ends with the same echo, no confirmation, yet something continues beneath. The gap between them grows thinner with each retelling. The official narrative says the regiment was misplaced. The local song says they never left. Between the two lies a field that in winter still hums faintly when the frost settles deep enough. In the months following the battle, official communication turned quickly from combat reports to reconstruction orders. The colored regiments that had fought near Nashville were never mentioned by name again. A circular issued from the War Department in early 1865 stated, "Detachments dissolved. Personnel redistributed as conditions permit." The tone was procedural final. The silence that followed felt less like omission and more like closure, as though the disappearance had been converted into paperwork. The event was folded neatly into the archive and sealed beneath administration. By 1870, a veteran named Corporal Elias Hurd petitioned for back pay, claiming to have been part of a colored detachment sent forward on the morning of December 15th. His claim was denied on grounds of no record of service. In the margin of his application, an anonymous clerk wrote "Unit Unidentified." Hurd died the following year in an asylum, his file labeled inconclusive. The ledger now preserves both his handwriting and his erasure, a man existing only as an administrative question. When the war's official history volumes were published, the editors noted loss of several field reports due to dampness. The absence became an asterisk, footnoted and rationalized. Readers encounter the phrase "records lost" and move on. Yet those two words conceal the weight of lives whose movements were never recorded. Every missing page transforms into a shallow grave without soil. A second report surfaced in 1877, written by an engineer who surveyed farmland south of Nashville. His notes mention metal fragments, musket stocks, and uniform buttons of colored regiments. He recommended further inspection, but his superiors ignored the advice. The items were boxed labeled miscellaneous ordnance and sent to storage. No record of retrieval exists. The ground disturbed but unexplored returned quietly to Frost. In 1892, a Union veterans reunion in Ohio included a brief speech from a former officer who mentioned the colored battalion that went forward and did not return. His words received polite applause but no questions. Newspapers summarized his talk as anecdote of valor. No one recorded his name. The following day's edition omitted the reference entirely. It was as if the words had evaporated overnight. At the turn of the century, a box of hospital letters surfaced in a private collection. Among them, a note from a nurse named Sarah Colvin read, "They told me not to ask where the black boys went. They said it wasn't for me to record." Her refusal to omit their story stands as one of the few acts of resistance preserved on paper. The letter remained unsent, discovered decades later in a trunk beneath her bed. The envelope bears only a single word written in pencil kept. The folklore that grew from this silence began as memory and ended as music. Among spirituals recorded by John Work III at Fisk University in the 1930s, several contain verses referring to soldiers who marched through cold ground. The melody is slow, almost funereal. In some versions, the refrain changes to "cold ground won't take them in." The line transforms Frost from burial into refusal, turning loss into endurance. The voices preserve what records erased. In one WPA interview, an aged woman from Rutherford County told her listener, "Them soldiers don't rest, 'cause the world ain't called their names yet." When asked how she knew, she answered, "You hear 'em when you listen right." She meant the cadence in Frozen Wind, the whispering rhythm that returns every December. The field worker transcribed her words faithfully but added in brackets, superstitious tone. Even accuracy could not escape dismissal. In nearby Williamson County, families held quiet vigils during the winter solstice. They placed tin scraps on fences so the wind would strike them in rhythm. The sound echoed across frozen ground, small metallic footsteps repeating in air. When researchers asked why, an old farmer replied, "So the ones who march too far can still find home." His statement merged commemoration and belief without distinction. During the 1940s, as oral history gained academic attention, folklorists debated whether such practices reflected trauma or myth. The Nashville accounts blurred both categories. Each generation repeated the story with minor variations but identical rhythm. The advance before dawn, the frost, the silence, the sound that stayed. The consistency across distance and time suggested memory preserved not by detail but by cadence. Modern scholars revisiting these collections note how language itself becomes ritual. Words like "gone frost" and "march" recur in nearly every transcript. Their repetition forms a litany, a structure that resists finality. The story renews itself each time it is told. In the absence of a burial site, the retelling becomes the memorial. A curious link appears in early 20th century church records from northern Tennessee. Several congregations list annual remembrance services for the unnamed. The service notes contain no explanation. In one program written in longhand, the hymn is simply titled, "Cold Ground, Keep Their Company." The lines mirror those sung 70 years earlier. Through song, the archive of sound replaces the archive of ink. In 1956, a sociologist conducting fieldwork recorded a local saying, "History bury what it can't explain." The phrase was used to describe the soldiers lost to Nashville's frost. The statement captures the mechanism by which disappearance becomes preservation. To remain unverified is to remain eternal. The missing do not end. They wait. Later generations of historians have tried to quantify the gap, counting enlistment numbers, verifying payrolls, measuring absence like data. Yet every equation ends with remainder. The missing resist calculation. The ledger cannot account for rhythm, and the rhythm cannot die where paper stops. In 1979, a group of local teachers organized a winter gathering on the ridge. They read aloud the known names of the 17th USCT, followed by the number 229. After the last name, they stood in silence for a full minute. A child present that night later recalled hearing something like a slow drum beat under the ground. The adults dismissed it as imagination. The transcript of the event calls it ambient vibration. Scientific investigation arrived once more in the 1990s. Researchers measured minor ground tremors caused by shifting ice layers. The rhythm recorded matched human marching cadence almost perfectly. The report concludes phenomenon consistent with frost heave. Yet even the data could not erase the echo. The sound aligned too precisely with the story told for over a century. Through these decades, the story transformed into a mirror. The facts receded, the folklore advanced. Each time one moved forward, the other stepped back, a march in rhythm but never unison. Together they created a reflection history and haunting walking side by side. The more the record sought to contain the silence, the louder that silence became. By the early 2000s, younger descendants began petitioning for a memorial. They asked not for certainty, only recognition. Put their names somewhere, one woman said, even if we don't know where they rest. The proposal remains pending. Bureaucracy still requires proof before remembrance. But the field untouched has already become its own memorial, invisible, unmarked, enduring. At the intersection of record and reverence, only one truth remains. Fact stops where paper ends and memory begins where breath continues. The ridge still waits, frost forming before sunrise. When the air stills enough to listen, the cadence returns, not ghostly, not miraculous, simply persistent. The sound of history, marching back through silence, step by step, toward a recognition that has not yet arrived. In the archive, silence has weight. Every page missing, every name erased, carries the same pressure as a heartbeat that has stopped mid-sound. Historians read through ledgers and find not information, but air-dense, immovable, heavy, with what should have been written there. The report of the 17th U.S. Colored Troops ends abruptly in the middle of a sentence. Advancing under heavy fog, no signal received. The next page is blank. It is not damage, it is pause. A silence precise enough to be intentional. The last known document from that winter was an unsigned memo attached to a requisition form. It reads, "No remains recovered." Sound continues after inspection. No historian has explained what sound refers to. The archivist underlined the phrase twice in red pencil before filing it. Each generation of researchers reads it differently, as clerical metaphor, as superstition, as a literal note. The ambiguity holds undisturbed like the frost itself. When Whitfield's lost recording was recovered from his satchel in 1942, the archivists dismissed the end of the reel as damaged audio. But when replayed years later on digital equipment, the final seconds contained faint rhythm. 3 slow beats, then 2, the same tempo used for Union drill cadence. The static carried no words, only pulse. Listeners debated whether it was machine noise or wind against the microphone. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, then stopped. On the ridge outside Nashville, the silence behaves like memory. Visitors describe the air as listening back. Each winter, frost gathers early there. Even at midday, the ground shines white long after surrounding fields have thawed. When people walk across it, their own footsteps sound delayed, as though answered by another pace beneath. Scientists attribute the echo to frozen air pockets under soil. The locals call it roll call. A researcher from Vanderbilt University once recorded ambient vibration there on a night below freezing. She wrote, "At 11:37 p.m., the ground began to pulse uniform, steady 2-second intervals lasting almost a minute. Her supervisor annotated artifact of wind resonance. She crossed out the note in her copy, leaving only the words, 'It felt human.'" The report was never published. The songs collected from nearby churches repeat the same rhythm. One spiritual begins, softly almost whispered, "Cold ground, rise and answer me. Marching still, where eyes can't see." Each verse is separated by a long pause, as if waiting for something to respond. The silence between the lines is longer than the song itself. That silence becomes its chorus. Some scholars call this persistence archival haunting, when what history refuses to hold returns in another form, sound, weather, repetition. In this case, the haunting is not spectral but procedural. The same error copied forward across decades. The same missing signature replicated on every list. The absence multiplied begins to move on its own. A librarian who once handled the original field log described the sensation afterward. "When I closed it, the room felt heavier. Not frightening, just aware." She did not include the line in her report but mentioned it later in an interview. It was the closest anyone came to saying aloud what the document suggests, that the ground beneath those pages still breathes. The intersection of fact and folklore narrows until they overlap completely. The song's rhythm matches the static on the tape. The cadence of marching aligns with the seismic vibration recorded under frost. Each fragment mirrors another, completing a circuit that no longer distinguishes truth from echo. It is as if the missing men have found a way to write back not through ink but through recurrence. In that convergence, the story reaches its still point. There is no revelation, no discovery of bones or letters or proof. Only the steady low pulse that refuses to end. It moves through paper, through air, through silence. The same pattern that once marked their advance continues now in the rhythm of what remains. Today, the official ledger for the Battle of Nashville remains unchanged. Between pages that detail victories and losses, a single gap persists, a blank line where the record of the colored troops should stand. Historians cite misfiling confusion, destroyed paperwork. Yet none can explain why, after a century and a half, the entry was never corrected. The dash is still there. The absence has become part of the archive itself. At the Tennessee State Library, the folder labeled Unlocated Action, Colored Troops, December 15 to 16, 1864, rests in a drawer few open. The paper is brittle, its corners frayed from being handled by those searching for names. The last entry inside reads, "Oral evidence persists." That phrase, neither fact nor dismissal, hangs like a whisper. The typewriter ink has begun to pale but not fade. In 2003, a restoration team used ultraviolet light to examine the original field log. Beneath the visible ink of the first page, another line emerged, faint but clear. "We answered when no one called." The archivists filed the discovery without commentary. The note remains unpublished. Locals still avoid the ridge after dark. They say frost forms faster there, coating grass before elsewhere. Hunters report hearing a distant cadence when the wind drops. It is never constant, never loud, a pattern felt more than heard. Science explains it as air pockets releasing from frozen soil. Oral memory calls it the roll call continuing. The descendants of the missing men still search for proof. Church groups organize winter vigils, reading the names of every soldier from the 17th USCT, even those accounted for. They pause between each name. The silence is longer for the ones no one can trace. Some bring soil from the ridge and sprinkle it over family graves, returning earth to earth. Each generation of scholars returns to the same materials: the broken map, the faded correspondence, the lost tape of Whitfield's final field trip. Every attempt to close the record ends where the frost begins. The absence resists completion, as though memory itself were protecting what history forgot. In the logic of documentation, what cannot be located does not exist. In the language of the living, what cannot be forgotten must. Between these two truths lies the charge no one remembered, not because it was small, but because it was unfinished. Maybe they did not disappear. Maybe we did. And if you listen closely, when the ground freezes, when the air stills, the silence carries its own reply. The rhythm never stopped. The march continues somewhere beneath the cold ground of Nashville, where ink failed but sound endures.